Larry Arnett, United States Army, Vietnam. Larry is one of my many helicopter pilots in Vietnam at a time where they really needed helicopter pilots. 1970, 1971, he was about 20 years of age. He went to training in Fort Walters, Texas, and then Fort Rucker, Alabama. Served with the 176th Assault Helicopter Company, which is part of the 14th Combat Helicopter Battalion, Americal Division, the 23rd Infantry Division. Folks, this is the real thing. Larry's story is one of the longest stories I've ever recorded. Frankfort, Kentucky, May 31st, 2006, I met Larry, and it's been a pleasure knowing him all these years. And just a great story from Vietnam and the things that he experienced. He was part of Lam Song 719, if you know your military history. And I'm just so proud to present him on the Voices of History YouTube channel. One of my unsung heroes, one of my heroes. I want to thank John Penn. I just want to stop and say, John's a truck driver, folks. He's out there driving every day. He's supporting my work and my radio station. And John, I love you, brother. Love you in the Lord. Thank you for your help and your support of this work and making it possible for me to bring my audience today Larry Arnett's story. So thank you so much, John. Folks, if you'd like to be a sponsor, there's information in the video description. I would encourage you to do so. It takes a lot of resources. Don't take it for granted. These stories are going to be here tomorrow. I want them to be here tomorrow, but there's a lot of work involved and a lot of, like I said, a lot of resources here. And I'd be grateful to have your help. My website's larrycappetto.com. You can click on Sponsor a Vet, see all these pictures of my veterans, and then decide which one you want to sponsor. If you'd like to just donate to my work, I appreciate that. There's information in the comment section. So I want to also encourage you, go over to Voices of History Radio, whether you listen to it or not, share it with a child, share it with a young person. That's who I'm focused on now, or our students. Our students can have in the palm of their hand an app which will allow them to listen to living history 24 hours a day. Folks, that's powerful. That is powerful. I never cease to be amazed. I turn on my phone or whatever, I'm listening to this radio station, and it's wonderful to hear these stories. All these stories. I love all these veterans I've interviewed, and it's there, folks. Also, our truck drivers. I want to start a group of truck drivers listening to the station and mention them on the air too. So if you're a truck driver, know someone who's a truck driver, or want to just tell a truck driver, it'd be greatly, greatly appreciated, because I think all those hours they drive, they would be listening to the history that has allowed us to live free all these years, and we're under attack now, even in our own country. Read some of the YouTube comments, are amazing, amazing. So, okay, thank you for sharing these stories. Thank you for subscribing to this channel, and my heart's full always. It's getting close to Memorial Day, and it's a meaningful time for me. So, check out KVOH, Voices of History Radio. Amen. God bless you.
Vietnam helicopter pilot. What years were you over there?
I spent 1970-71 in Vietnam.
When you got to Vietnam, Larry, was it what you thought it was going to be when you first stepped off that plane and you arrived? And I mean, what did you experience? Remember what you felt?
Well, I think any 20-year-old helicopter pilot's going to tell you that he was full of piss and vinegar, and he was ready to accept the challenge. So when I flew into Vietnam, it was probably exciting and not quite exhilarating. It was kind of unique. I remember traveling in a bus that had iron bars and mesh on the sides of the window going from the airplane to the billets, and that was an indicator that maybe it was a little more hazardous than what we were anticipating.
So you're 20 years old at the time?
Yes, 20 years old.
You've never been in combat?
No, no.
You're trained, you're ready to go. You've heard all these things about Vietnam. You're there. Probably a lot of your friends are there. And what I'd like to take some time to do is just tell me a little bit about the Huey helicopter, what it was used for, and then I'm going to have you take me into an actual mission, a combat mission that you flew. So just give me a little bit of overview of the Huey and how it was used in Vietnam.
The Huey was the workhorse of the Vietnam War. It was also the Cadillac of helicopters at the time. We grew up through flight training, going through the TH-55 or the OH-23, which were rudimentary training helicopters. So when we got into the Huey, to have something that powerful and with the finesse that it was able to operate with was great. We loved it. It was easy to fly compared to the training helicopters that we had been in. When I got to Vietnam, we were ready. I think we were trained. We knew enough about flying to get the bird up in the air and take it somewhere and hopefully get it back. You really learned your skill of flying the helicopter in Vietnam. If you're flying for 8 to 10 hours a day, then the opportunity to learn how to fly is there. So the old adage that if you you could land on a dime and give a nickel's back of change. So you really learned the real finesse of flying over there. When I got into Benoit, we had an opportunity to, they give you a dream sheet and you had an opportunity to pick where you wanted to be stationed. Well, I picked the 173rd Airborne. There was 3 or 4 major units in and around Saigon there, so I picked all of those. And about 3 days later, we got back our assignments, and it said Chu Lai. I said, "Where in the hell is Chu Lai?" And they had a big map on the wall there, so I got to looking, and I said, "Well, since I picked it around Saigon, maybe it's around Saigon." Well, I got to walking up Vietnam, and it turns out that Chu Lai was an I Corps, which was in the northern part of South Vietnam. So most of the other people that I was with, about 5 or 6 other friends that I had there, got their assignments in and around where they had asked for. So a few days later, I picked up on a C-130 aircraft and flew north and got into to Chu Lai. I was assigned to the 176th Assault Helicopter Company, 14th Combat Aviation Battalion, in the Americal Division, 23rd Infantry Division. And that was, the headquarters was in Chu Lai, but they also had a brigade in Duc Pho and in Da Nang. So it was a pretty wide area of operation.
Back at Benning, or where did you have your training on the Hueys?
When you go into flight school back in the 1969-70 era, all of the training for primary flight school was at Fort Walters, Texas. So we went down there. It was an opportunity to be out in the desert. They gave us plenty of room. No one really knew how to fly helicopters, so they spread us out to make sure we didn't run into each other. So they gave us plenty of desert to run around in. And they gave us either one of 2 models, the TH-55 or the OH-23. The OH-23 was pretty much for the taller guys. The TH-55 was I think the better aircraft. When you finished primary flight school at Fort Walters, Texas, then you went to Fort Rucker, Alabama. And at Fort Rucker was where you transitioned into the UH-1 Huey. We call it a Huey. And it was a tremendous transition to actually be put into the Cadillac of the helicopters at the time. Here you are, 20 years old. They give you, at that time, a $250,000 aircraft and say, go out and fly the daggone thing. So it was great.
When you were training, were they preparing you for combat assault missions? I guess my question is, can they really prepare you for what it's really like?
No, I don't think so. I think the training was more or less to get you familiar with the aircraft, put you in a situation where you could take off and land. At that time, they were needing helicopter pilots, and every 2 weeks they would run a class of 200 commissioned officers, 200 warrant officers, and 200 South Vietnamese. So every 2 weeks they were starting a class of 600 potential helicopter pilots. So they were turning them out like biscuits. And while we did lose some of our trainees during flight school, essentially they taught you how to take off and land. And that was it. And then they shipped you over to Vietnam.
Larry, I'm just very intrigued by the helicopters, just like I was the Higgins boats that he took into Normandy and Iwo Jima and all that, and realizing the importance of that workhorse. I mean, it was, the air cavalry. I mean, we weren't riding horses; we were using helicopters. So we're going into battle, and I think Hollywood glamorizes it a little bit. But I always ask the pilots, was it like flying in the battle with Creedence Clearwater Revival blasting and
I watched Apocalypse Now too, and there were times when it was like that. Most of the time, however, probably the same way with Louis in the Higgins boats, it was work. And you got up early in the morning and you pre-flighted your aircraft and you already were briefed. You got briefed on your mission, and then you went out and did your work. And 10 hours later, 11 hours later, you may get back to your hooch that night. The difficulty that we encountered with the Americal division was that we were attached to the Americal for support. They were an infantry division. I don't think that most of the people who worked in the division fully understood at that time the limitations and what it takes to keep a helicopter up and running. Pilots need to eat. Huey aircraft need fuel, and pilots need a little bit of rest every now and then. But the Americal division flew us, and they exceeded the normal amount of hours that the safety school back at Fort Rucker said any pilot ought to be flying. But it was combat, and so we understood that. Now, the varying missions that we would go on, I flew what was called the Slick. The Slick is nothing but a UH-1 Huey aircraft, 2 M60 machine guns on each side. You had a crew chief and a gunner. Each one of them had a M60 machine gun. That was our protection. Now, you've heard about the gunships. The gunship was nothing more than a Huey that was rigged up on the right-hand side with a minigun, which fired 7.62 bullets at a high rate, 4,000 rounds a minute. And on the left-hand side, he may have had a rocket pod of rockets. Those were the best protective mechanisms that I think the Army put together. We would go in a combat assault, and we would be carrying troops in with our Slicks, and we would have on our sides gunships. The gunships at that stage, rigged out of the Huey, were able to fly at the same speed as the Slicks, so they were able to stay with us all the way down through to the LZ. They would prep it with their rockets and their miniguns as we were going in. If we were taking fire, we told them what direction we were taking fire. They were able to angle the weaponry over there to suppress that as we were going in. Later on, we moved into the Cobras. Cobras, unfortunately for us Slick pilots, the Cobras just flew too fast, and they were not able to stay with us all the way down to the grounds like the gunships did.
You referred to some of the crew, but tell me about the crew on a Huey and the responsibility of these people, what they did.
The aircraft commander in a UH-1 Huey is responsible completely for the operation and safety of that aircraft. You have a co-pilot. Although the Huey can be flown with one pilot, in combat obviously you have an aircraft commander and you have a co-pilot. Equally trained, aircraft commander normally is much more experienced, and his job is to help train that co-pilot. In the back, we had our crew chief. The crew chief was responsible for the maintenance of that aircraft, making sure that it was ready to fly at a moment's notice for all of the missions. The gunner was strictly a gunner, and although he assisted the crew chief in whatever needed to be done with the aircraft, the fact was that the gunner was there to provide protection of the aircraft on the other side with an M60 machine gun. So the normal crew for a UH-1 Huey was 4 people.
There's no medical person on board?
No, when you get into the medevac helicopter, it was a UH-1 Huey, but it was assigned specifically to a medevac unit, and therefore you had medical personnel on that mission. The thing about flying slicks in an assault helicopter company was that you had a variety of missions. You could be flying combat assault one day, taking troops into a hot LZ on missions. You could be resupplying those same troops out in the jungles, whether it be in the tall grass or it was in triple canopy jungle. Your job was to make sure that you got the ammunition, the food, replacements out there to them. We also did many medevac missions. You know, you hear of the medevac helicopter and their missions, but the fact is that the assault helicopter company Huey probably did as many medevac missions as the true medevac company. Why? Well, we were there. We were there either during the combat assault when somebody got wounded, or we were there doing resupply in the vicinity when somebody needed to be extracted, and we were able to do that.
I've got a lot of questions. I mean, we have a certain amount of time, but can you take me into a mission just from the liftoff, getting the crew aboard, going into a hot LZ, as it were, if you know it's hot at the time, and then just what you're encountering as a pilot, what you're seeing, and then landing, troops, no troops, wounded on board. Just take me through some of that.
Let's the mission of the UH-1 Huey was to be available for a variety of missions. If the mission came down that said tomorrow you're going to be taking American troops into a hot LZ because there's been enemy activity in this area and they're going to run a company of troops into that area, your task was to be available. We would get an initial briefing from operations. We would go out and pre-flight the helicopter. Normally we would be in a flight of 5 or maybe 2 flights of 5 helicopters if it was a large repositioning of troops. Each one of those flights was headed by a flight leader. Normally it was the most experienced pilot in that particular organization as flight leader. We would take off. We would be under the control of what was called the Air Mission Commander. Air Mission Commander was in a single Huey flying much higher than we would be flying. They would go out and pick up the battalion commander of the unit that was being replaced, and he would be in communications. They would tell us from the back seat, they would tell the pilot, okay, we're going to be going into this particular coordinate. And so he would guide, that Air Mission Commander would guide those flights of helicopters into that LZ. Now, anytime that we went out on a combat assault, we were always accompanied by our gunships for obvious reasons. So when we reached the landing zone, or LZ, then most of the time the gunships would prep that LZ with their rockets and their miniguns, and that was for obviously a couple of reasons. One was to suppress any enemy that was there. It was also designed to explode any booby traps that may be in the area, and to just tell the bad guys, better get your heads down. We would be flying in our flight of 5 or flight of 10, 2 flights of 5, and we would land. The troops on board would immediately disperse into the tall grass or the mountains, and then they would begin their land mission. We would then take off, go back, get more, and continue to bring them in there until the entire battalion or company was put in there. There were many times when our helicopters would take fire. Our crew chief and gunner was there to help suppress that fire. The trick in being a pilot was to make sure that you did not lose your focus even under fire. Your job was to get those troops on the ground safely so that they could do their mission. So you stayed focused until you got the helicopter on the ground, and then you got it out of the LZ and back up and do the same thing over and over again. There were some days when we would be doing that all day long, depending on how large the mission and the complement of soldiers that we were putting into.
Tell me about what you remember about other gunships or other ships being shot at, even crashing, and how you kept your focus, and then just the incoming rounds, and were people ever hit on board getting on and off, and then did it get chaotic at times?
I don't think there's probably very many helicopter pilots that will come back to you and say that they received no shots into their aircraft. A lot of them will say, well, so-and-so got wounded. There were several of them, obviously, that got shot down. One mission in particular that I was on, we were doing resupply that day to the grunts, the infantrymen that were out in the mountains, and they had found a bunker complex, and they wanted some grenades, concussion grenades, and other things that they were going to blow up these bunkers and move on, try to make sure that the enemy didn't use them again. We went back and we got those from the cantonment area and were flying out. And what they had done was cut in this triple canopy jungle. And in Vietnam, you were either in the flatlands where the grass was, but most likely you were out in the mountains. And it was triple canopy jungle. So what you have is heavy trees at this level, and they were very tall trees, and then you had another canopy of trees and leaves and so forth. And then you get down to a cleared area down here. Well, they would take C4 or whatever, and they would blow these trees down to open up enough area for the helicopter to hover down through and drop off its cache. Well, we got down and they were taking, there had not been any fire in this particular AO that morning, but obviously they knew that since there were bunkers there, the enemy had to be around. And to minimize the opportunity of the helicopter being shot, we would do what's called a high overhead. And a high overhead is nothing more than coming down in a very tight spiral, flaring out just above the opening into the trees, and then you would hover down. And that just eliminated the opportunity for the bad guys to shoot at you. Well, just as we were getting ready to hover down into the trees, all hell breaks loose. The fact was that there was a bad guy down there and he had opened up. All of a sudden, my cyclic, in a helicopter, you have a collective which allows the Huey to go up and down, and you have the cyclic, which allows you to turn. My cyclic bound and went very, very tight, and I thought that they had shot out my hydraulics. And that's when training takes over. Training that we did get back in flight school takes over because you have no opportunity to react other than doing what is best. And so I muscled it out of there, and what occurred was that the bad guys had shot my co-pilot, and they shot him in the leg, and his legs had come up around the cyclic and had bound the cyclic. So the sweetest music in the world was my crew chief and gunner opening up with those M60 machine guns with that suppressive fire. They just laid down that fire, and I think two things saved not only the aircraft but saved our lives. One was that the North Vietnamese soldier who was down there with his AK-47 that opened up fire couldn't wait. If he had waited another 20 seconds till I was further down into the trees, it would have been much more difficult to extract myself from that situation. The other thing was the suppressive fire of those two M60 machine guns. But I was able to pull myself out of there and go ahead and take him back to the hospital. And he was a new guy. Unfortunately, he had only been in country maybe 8 weeks, and He was a brand new guy, but he got a Purple Heart, and we went over to the hospital later on to see him. I don't even remember his name today, but he was very fortunate, as we all were, to get out of that. One of the things that you'll find about pilots is that they pride themselves on being cool in combat. It's just part of that macho image that the helicopter pilot somewhat kins to the old jet jockeys out there. So when you're taking fire, it is very important not only to remain cool, but to sound cool over the radio when you're talking back to your headquarters or talking to the people on the ground. So the trick is to make this is nothing. You know, we'll go back and I'll get me a new co-pilot and get me a new ship, and I'll be back out. And that's exactly what we did. We went back, took him to the hospital. I called operations. They got me a new co-pilot, and the aircraft had been shot up pretty badly, so we exchanged aircrafts and went back out. And this time they called in the gunships, saturated the area in and around the LZ with rockets, and just to make sure that the bad guys weren't there. We were able to deliver the goods, and they accomplished the task.
Boy, tell me about, Larry, the this is the hair here. Tell me about how you got names for your helicopters. I mean, I've heard and I've seen on the, you know, how do you name a helicopter? After a girlfriend or a bad girlfriend or what?
Well, we had several of the companies allowed the ships to be decorated. Some did not. You've seen some of the old gunships that had the tiger shark teeth on it, and well, in my particular case, in a slick, the one place that we were able to design and do something with was the battery compartment door, which was right on the nose of the Huey. And after you got to be aircraft commander, you were pretty much assigned a particular aircraft, and that was the one that you flew most of the time. Had a great ship. It was tail number 592. I remember it to this day, and I was able to take that nose compartment door off, take it down to a local Vietnamese painter downtown, and I took him a picture of a horse, the horse's head. Being from Kentucky, I had Kentucky written across the top of it, and here was this beautiful horse's head in the middle of it, and my call sign was 14. So we had Kentucky 14 there with a beautiful horse's head. So it really depended on how you wanted to decorate the aircraft. It was pretty much the aircraft commander's call. Company commanders back at that stage gave you pretty good latitude as far as decorating the aircraft. Most of the slicks did not have decoration did not have decorations, but some did.
I like that. Tell me about the protection you had. You mentioned armor plating around the seats. Did the crew chief or the guys in the back? I had one infantry guy tell me there was some type of they rigged up some type of thing to protect them because when they were shooting. So what kind of armor plating and all that, and where was it at?
Most of the armor protection was for the pilot and the co-pilot. Obviously, if the pilot and co-pilot get shot, the crew chief and gunner are gone too. If the aircraft has no pilot up front, then the aircraft is going to go down, and the crew chief and the gunner are going to go down with it. So most of the protection, we had the pilot and co-pilot both had a armor-plated seat. Not only under your bottom had real thick armor plating, but on the side next to the exit to the aircraft, next to the door, there was a plate that you could extend that was also armor plating, which would protect you coming in this way. The problem got to be is that there was no protection from the front. To fly the Huey, you must be able to see. Well, the Huey has this beautiful canopy out front of clear plexiglass to allow you to see as much as you can. And from that perspective, the most vulnerable position that was for the pilot and co-pilot were was from the front. Now the crew chief and gunner had only an armor-plated seat to sit on, because if they were going to take fire, it could come from the bottom of the aircraft, from underneath, and so that afforded them some protection. But they had that M60 machine gun, and it had to have a clear area of vision for firing. Plus, that was where the door would open to allow troops to come in. So there was really no protection for the crew chief and gunner other than our armor-plated seat.
Well, if I was on the ground shooting a helicopter, where am I going to shoot to make the most damage?
They would teach you to fly. If you're going to shoot an aircraft down, it flies so fast that you had to fire in front of it. So normally that fire they would just spray. They would just shoot up, so let you fly through the bullets and hope that it hit. The nice thing about it was that the Huey, as well as all other helicopters, was not that easy to shoot down unless you obviously hit the pilot or co-pilot, but also if you triggered and hit the transmission line, which would freeze up the transmission, or you broke the blades to where you could not get the lift. Most of the time, if you had a crashed helicopter, it was because of significant trauma up front to the pilot and co-pilot.
Tell me about, did you see some of the ships get shot down at times? I mean, were you visually aware of it, or was it just you heard about it on the radio, or were there a couple times where you saw that?
One of the missions that I worked on was Lamson 719, which was the sending of troops into Laos from Vietnam, and also going back in and extracting them. The mission itself was a total fiasco. They sent South Vietnamese regulars into Laos. The North Vietnamese Army knew that they were coming. They set up opportunities to defeat the South Vietnamese Army. We flew them in. We also went back and extracted them. Well, one of the missions that we had on an extraction, we flew up to Quang Tri, and our task was, along with hundreds of other helicopters, was to go in and extract the South Vietnamese Army that had been totally beaten. One of the fire bases over there, the South Vietnamese troops had gotten to that fire base, and they had no leadership. The leaders had all been killed either by the bad guys or the good guys, and they were on this fire base, and the North Vietnamese had ringed the fire base with 50 caliber machine guns. Some wise person up in division headquarters said, well, we need to resupply them with ammunition. So they rigged up 2 flights of 5 helicopters they put inside this Huey a large pallet of ammunition. We were flying that ammunition out. I was in the lead ship in the second flight of 5. The first flight of 5, we flew out and made a U-turn and came back over the fire base. And the plan was to kick those pallets of ammunition out, and they would land in the fire base. Well, the first flight of 5 did that, and 4 of them landed outside the perimeter. All we did was reinforce the bad guys with ammunition. The 5th one landed inside the perimeter and exploded. Well, the Air Mission Commander at that stage decided that was a bad mission, but unfortunately it became too late for one of our ships. As the second flight of 5 was turning around and was headed back, the Air Mission Commander was just about to cancel the mission. My Chalk 4, which was my 4th aircraft in my flight, said trails on fire and going down. And what had occurred was that the North Vietnamese had a 37 millimeter anti-aircraft weapon down there and had shot the trail aircraft, my last number 5 aircraft in my flight, and had hit that pallet of ammunition that we were carrying and just exploded the aircraft, and he went down, and we lost that entire crew that day. Whether the mission was properly planned, it was executed by the pilots to a high degree, but it was not successful. Later on, they made a decision that says, look, we're not going to be able to get in there and do anything with those guys. That night, those South Vietnamese troops were told, you're going to have to break out on your own, and we'll pick you up. So they picked up a place over here about 2,000 yards outside of the fire base. That night, the South Vietnamese broke out of that ringed perimeter. We were flying in at daylight. We flew in, and it was a rabble. No leadership. They had tossed their weapons. They wanted nothing more than just to get out of there. And what occurred was that the first ship to land in the LZ got bogged down. Too many South Vietnamese soldiers getting on there. The order came down from the Air Mission Commander, come to only to a 6-foot hover. The pilot came into a 6-foot hover, and they loaded them up. We actually had opportunities where the crew chiefs had to literally beat the good guys off of the aircraft because they made it too heavy to get out of the LZ for the next ship to land. It got so bad that the Air Mission Commander gave us the order to put transmission fluid on the skids because they were hanging on to the skids. Now, if you want to see a sight, we were flying out at 5,000 feet, flying back at 10,000 feet. On one of the flights out, I looked up and I saw this Huey coming back, and there was this South Vietnamese soldier holding on to the skids for dear life at 10,000 feet. Now, whether he made it, I don't know. But we successfully evacuated the South Vietnamese troops from that location. The bad guys knew we were coming in there, so they were walking in mortars to the location. It was an opportunity. Obviously, the mission itself overall failed, but a lot of good people, to include my crew in my flight, paid the price.
And I wanted to ask you about those that you lost during your tour in Vietnam. I mean, you'd go out on a mission, maybe you come back and they weren't there. I mean, did that affect you at the time, or was it years later that maybe it bothered you? And who did you
Curiously, when you lose a crew or you lose an individual pilot, you were strangely detached. I think maybe that was just a mechanism that we used to not get that close. The camaraderie in an aviation unit was high. You got to be very, very close. You knew who could fly the best. You knew who could fly the worst. One of the worst situations, we had a young man from 2nd Platoon. I was in 1st Platoon. 2nd Platoon was on a mission, landed on a fire base, decided that while he had a few minutes, he needed to go take a leak, and walked away from the aircraft, walked out, and the South Vietnamese had been on this fire base before, and the U.S. had just taken it over, and we were resupplying the U.S. troops. He walks out to the perimeter, and he triggers what's called a bouncing Betty, and that's nothing more than a grenade that pops up about waist level and explodes. And it exploded, and he was terribly injured. He flew back. It was one of the few instances that I'm aware of where they let his parents come over to South Vietnam to see him before he died. And I assume that was because they had some prestige level or influence level that allowed them to come into a combat zone to do that. But he died from that wound.
What about after a mission, a day or a week, whatever, and you come back? What type of debriefing, what type of activities did you guys do to unwind? Did you go to sleep at night thinking about all this, or how did you deal with all that?
I think one of the best opportunities that they gave us. We had we would come back from a 10-hour flight mission and come back. They had what's basically an officers club or an NCO club there on the base where you could get a good cold beer or a pizza and come back. One of the stress relievers, the USO, did a great job of coming over and providing entertainment periodically. They would have a movie. I think probably the best stress reliever was coming back and just sitting on your bunks and talking to your fellow aviators because they were going through the same issues. So you may or may not talk about the mission that you had just gone through, but the fact was that you were among friends. You were among friends that understood what you had just gone through, and that allowed you to de-stress to a degree.
Can you, when I say medevac and when you were used at times to take wounded out, can you remember a couple instances where that happened and what you were seeing? Do you want some water?
Okay.
Anything like that you can remember that, in my mind, I'm just imagining, a chaotic scene, might be hot LZ.
One of the more significant medevac missions that I undertook, we were flying combat assaults. We were putting this battalion of infantrymen into an LZ. The battalion commander was up with the air mission commander, and he was guiding his companies. We were putting his companies in. Normally an LZ, as I shared earlier, is prepped by gunships. Well, the battalion commander saw a young Vietnamese running through the jungle down there where the LZ was supposed to be. And he decided that maybe there were some friendlies in there, and he decided not to prep the LZ. We put the first 2 flights of 5 of grunts on the ground, and they began working toward their objective. And there was a command detonated explosion. They thought it was a 155 millimeter howitzer shell that was command detonated, and it severely wounded the first sergeant and the radio operator, who was walking up toward around the company commander. I was trail that day, and I went down and picked these 2 guys up. I go down and I land in the LZ. The troops bring these 2 soldiers on board. They're severely wounded. I remember the first sergeant was an African American, and I immediately get up and nose it over and head back to the hospital as fast as I can. I get a call from the battalion commander. He says, "Make sure that you let me know how he's doing." So when I landed at the hospital and they took him into the hospital, I waited and I asked them to give me a status. And they came back out and said both of them were dead. And I had to relay that back to the battalion commander. So a medevac was successful in Vietnam a lot of the times. The survival rate of soldiers in Vietnam was increased dramatically because of the ability to medevac them back to a hospital quickly using the helicopter. But there were occasions where that just did not work.
And the actual helicopters that had the Red Crosses that were medevac helicopters, they had no protection. They didn't carry any guns, right?
Normally, the medevac company, and you would have to talk with a medevac helicopter pilot to get the parameters of their flight missions. But I understand that normally a medevac helicopter would not go out unless he was accompanied by gunships, so that he would have some protection in that LZ to pick up that patient.
Wouldn't that be a target though, the Red Cross on that thing?
I think any helicopter was a target. Whether it had a Red Cross on it or not. I don't think that deterred the enemy from shooting it. Just like in other wars, the medics got hit and killed just as easily and as quickly as the grunt did.
What about the troops that you transported, Larry? I mean, like going into Normandy, I asked the question, what were you thinking about? What were you seeing? Were you hunkered down? Were you nervous? Were you talking? I mean, was there any interaction like that among these troops? Probably the first time in combat for a lot of them. Were they like scared, or were they just all gung ho, invincible? We're never, that bullet's not going to hit me. I mean, how'd they feel?
I think the good Lord gives us the capability as young 19, 20, 21-year-olds to feel invincible. So I did not see a lot of fear in the soldiers. I think what I did see was a lot of camaraderie. I saw a lot of let's take care of each other in the combat situation. The key was that our mission, and I think when you talk to any helicopter pilot, they're going to tell you that our mission was to do whatever it took for that grunt. We took a lot of pride in making sure that they were put into an LZ in the best way possible, particularly if it was hot, that we got them the resupplies, that we got them the food, the replacements, all of that. And if they were injured, nothing would stop us from getting down there and getting that soldier out of that hot spot and back to an LZ or back to the hospital. I think that was the kind of mutual support. You'll talk to a grunt and they say, well, I want to be a helicopter pilot if it was the last thing that was open. I'd rather be a grunt on the ground. Well, you're going to tell a helicopter pilot the same thing. Helicopter pilot's going to say, boy, I really would not want to be the grunt on the ground, but I'll do anything I can for that grunt down there to make sure that he gets what he needs to do his job.
Did you see that movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson? Did you see that movie?
I did.
Did any of that bring back any memories of the helicopter parts of the movie? I mean, a lot of it was Hollywood, but did you get a feel or flashback, or did it seem like it was authentic?
There was that was probably the best movie portraying, I think, the war in Vietnam that I have been able to see. It was very well done. It was not Platoon. It was not Hard Metal Jacket. It showed some of the rigors of war. It also showed, probably just as important, the trauma on families that had to remain back here at the States. It also showed the courage of the American soldier in combat. And so I'm very high on that particular movie of the Vietnam War.
I liked it. I just could imagine, the helicopters flying over, what it would have sounded like. It looked pretty authentic. Are there sights and sounds today that bring back Vietnam?
The one sound is the Huey whop whop whop. It has a very distinctive blade popping sound when the Huey flies, and you talk to the troops on the ground, and they say that was one of the best sounds that they have ever heard, is because it meant that they were either getting out, or they were getting chow, or they were getting something out there. So the sound of the Huey helicopter is very unique and very much representative of the Vietnam War. If you wanted to bring back the memories, that's probably the one that would do it. I'm hoping that while you've been here that you've had an opportunity to go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that we have here.
This afternoon.
Okay. I hope somebody is there to give you a tour. And I would be glad to do that, depending on what time you're going to be over there, because it has a story to tell.
The sundial?
Yes, there's a distinct story in that memorial.
Maybe
but
we can do that later.
If we can get the timing, I'd love to do that for you.
Have you been back to Washington D.C. and seen the Vietnam Wall?
I have seen the Vietnam Wall.
Tell me what you experienced when you saw that.
The first time that I actually got tears was tracking down the crew of that helicopter that was shot down outside of Quang Tri in the Lam Son 719 extraction. I think we all keep our emotions pretty well wrapped up. But to see those names, their names on the wall, was significant and very moving.
Do you go to the reunions at all? I think I asked you that. Are you going to go to the one in Washington?
I have not made any of the reunions for the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots, although I'm a life member of the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association. There will come a time when I make that meeting. I would love to see some of the guys that I served with. I think there were some that I had a great deal of respect for, and would love to see those guys. My old company commander, Captain Leo Pastoni, I just had an amazing respect for that individual. He had a handlebar mustache, blonde hair, and he was just a tough guy.
You hear a lot of things about Vietnam, Larry, so I'm going to ask you, were you around, or did you, and when I say experience, not personally, but the drug usage in Vietnam, you hear about these things, and then you hear about these vets that came home, they're messed up, you wonder if it was drugs, if it was they didn't receive the help they needed, but were there drugs in Vietnam?
I think the Vietnam veteran as a whole has gotten a bum rap from its association to the drug trade and drug usage over there. Sure, there was drug usage in Vietnam. It was not, however, prevalent in an aviation unit. You just could not afford to have drug usage in our aviation element, because if it was a maintenance guy, or if it was your crew chief, or if it was anyone else in the company, they were so important to ensuring that the helicopter was safe and that the mission was going to be successful, that there was just no tolerance for drug use. We would have health and welfare checks. And I recall this very cool one morning, 3:30 in the morning. They had caught several of us officers and told us that you're going to be involved in a health and welfare check. So we go over to the hooch where our enlisted soldiers were staying. They had gotten some indication that there may be some drugs. So you couldn't just go in and say, okay guys, I want to see your drugs. So you went in for a health and welfare check. Health and welfare was to check on anything that may be of detriment to the health of your troops in that unit. So we go in at 3:30 in the morning, we wake everybody up, they stand up next to their bunks, and they say, we open up your lockers. And sure enough, in this one guy's place, we find small vials of heroin, and that guy was shipped out that day. There was just no tolerance of drugs in an aviation unit. And whether there were drugs used by American soldiers over there, probably was. How significant was it? I can't tell you. It just was not where we were.
What about, did you receive a homecoming? A lot of the guys, pretty horrendous stories, but was there a homecoming for you? And tell me where it was, where you were and all that.
One of the national disgraces that we have in regards to the Vietnam War was the way the troops were responded to when they arrived back home. Now, part of this was the government's fault. The government decided early on that we would not activate the Guard and Reserve in any major way, and so troops were sent over as individual replacements, and then they came back as individuals. So a community did not have the opportunity to have a parade or have a large gathering where they could congratulate the returning soldiers. The soldier came back on his own. Unfortunately, if he was wearing a uniform, when he came back, he encountered some individuals at the airports and so forth that was not very good. When I came home, I stopped and got my shoes shined, and I actually got a straight razor shave at the airport, and flew into the Lexington, Kentucky airport. My mother and father were there, as well as my wife. And so my homecoming was very good from the standpoint that I did not encounter any of the horrific conditions there. What we did experience was people just did not want to talk about the Vietnam War. You came back into a community and you were a Vietnam vet, and there was no real time in the Vietnam War for de-stressing. They're doing better now for the American soldier. But we got hopped on a plane 3 days later. you were from a combat zone into civilian life where no one really understood war, and in reality, they didn't know how to approach it. So they didn't ask you questions. You didn't talk about it. And so it was as if, hey, I went to the beach, I'm back. And I think that allowed a lot of the stress and experiences to be bottled up for years for some of our troops. They just did not have a opportunity to talk about it.
When you were 15 years old, around 1965, I'm guessing, were you conscious when President Johnson ordered the air cav to Vietnam? I mean, were you thinking along the lines of someday I want to be a helicopter pilot? When did it dawn on you as you got older and as the war continued that you might be going? Did you want to go? What were your friends? You know what I'm saying? Then you wanted to be a pilot. I mean, how did that all happen? Give me the short version here.
When I was a freshman at Eastern Kentucky University, I joined the ROTC unit. It was mandatory at that stage of education to do that. When you become a junior, you make a decision: do I stay in ROTC to receive a commission, or do I go ahead and get out? The first 2 years were compulsory. The second 2 years were not. I decided to stay in ROTC and achieve a commission. When I made that decision, I knew that I would be going to Vietnam. It was just a matter of time. Upon graduation, I received my commission, my branch as infantry. Interesting enough, at that stage, they gave you an order from the U.S. Army, and it tracked you all the way through infantry officer basic, through flight school, and actually gave you your unit of assignment in Vietnam. And candidly, I was very proud to take that and show it to my brothers and say, hey, I'm going to be going to Vietnam. It's just a matter of me working through the schools, and I'm going to be going to Vietnam. So I was mentally prepared, and certainly getting out of infantry officer basic and then going to flight school for 9 months, you knew upon completion of flight school where you were going. So you had a great deal of opportunity to acclimate yourself to what you were going to be doing.
Just briefly back to combat, what were some of the radio transmissions? I mean, how are you talking to each other? You overstepping each other when it gets chaotic? Is there someone in charge? You have handles? How do you talk?
Each pilot was given a call sign. My call sign was Minuteman 14. The 176th Assault Helicopter Company, their call sign was Minuteman. And each pilot was given a number. So you were Minuteman 14 when you became the pilot over there. So the traffic over the radio was pretty well controlled. Because you were in a combat situation, you did not allow a lot of extraneous traffic to be gotten over the radio. It was talking from the Air Mission Commander, who was controlling the operation from way up here down to the flight leader. The flight leader would also then talk to his 5 or 10 ships that were going to be in behind him, but it was pretty well controlled. Now, what did occur would be if you started taking fire, then Chalk 4 or Chalk 3 would say, I'm taking fire from the left, 3 o'clock, or from the right, 3 o'clock. And that would allow the gunships and allow all of the other ships to know where the bad guys were and start taking some kind of, if not evasive action, some kind of protective action to do that. So radio traffic was controlled to a significant degree. We did have other channels where you could go up and talk a little bit more informally. We also had what was called the guard channel. The guard channel was a radio communication channel for emergency use only. And it was airwaves across South Vietnam. So if we heard anyone, whether it be fixed wing pilot or helicopter pilot, in distress, normally they would click up on guard and say that they were in trouble and hopefully where they were. And if anyone was close, then we would respond to go help them out.
Did you talk much about Vietnam in the years after, even current? I mean, like you are now?
I think the Vietnam veteran is just like veterans of all other wars. I think we came back We did not talk about the war. Vietnam was not a very popular war. When we came back, the citizenry was not interested in learning about your experiences. To this day, I would have liked to have talked to my father about his World War II service, and yet I have yet to talk to my son about my time in Vietnam. I think if we get an opportunity like this, or we get an opportunity to write it down or put it on a voice tape or whatever, we should do that. There's just not a lot of opportunities for that subject to come up.
Being a Vietnam veteran, Larry, and an American citizen, what does freedom mean to you?
I think anyone who has served in military uniform understands more than anyone else what freedom requires. It requires a lot of sacrifice, not only from the soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guard, who physically had to do his duty, but also the families who were left behind to take care of the children, to take care of the house, to take care of their jobs. Freedom today is probably more acutely borne by the citizenry of the United States because of the number of soldiers that we have fighting a war today. Freedom for any soldier is valuable. I think when Americans talk about freedom, they don't really understand what it requires to get it and to keep it. But if you serve in military uniform, you do. You have a much better appreciation for that.
What does the American flag mean and represent to you?
I'm very proud of our American flag. It's the symbol that's been flown around this world in many situations where we have been called on to protect not only our freedoms, but also those of other nations. It has represented proudly this nation, and it will continue to do so in the future.
Are you proud to be a Vietnam veteran?
Absolutely. I think if you talk to any Vietnam veteran, they're going to say that our service in Vietnam, and life-changing is probably too much of a definition, but it was important. We thought that we were doing good work. When our nation said, rally to the flag and go fight the war in Vietnam, Americans responded without hesitation and with pride and dignity. I did that as well as many thousands of others.
Have people thanked you over the years for your service, and how they make you feel?
I think we all want to be appreciated. It's a validation that what you did was important. And when you have particularly young people today come up to you and say, thank you very much for your service, that probably means as much as anything, because it means that we have another generation that is growing more appreciative of the service and the sacrifices made by those who served in military uniform.
Oh, this has been incredible. I could talk all day with you. I know we're not going to do that, but what do you want people to remember about Vietnam?
I think even if you did not support the war, it was important to support the troops. The lesson that we learned in Vietnam has carried over to today. While the wars that we fight today may be unpopular, the American public is very supportive of the troops that are fighting this war. And when we come back, they're having their parades and they're having the recognition by the communities and they're walking with pride for that service. And that's probably one of the most positive things to have come out of the Vietnam War. I'm very proud of that service in Vietnam because we set the stage for how we are fighting wars today and how we are responding to the troops when they return.
Did you ever feel any guilt for surviving? A lot of troops didn't come back, or was it, you never had to deal with that? Or
I don't think that the helicopter pilot felt that as acutely as the soldier who was on the ground with his rifle and bayonet and had to fight in a close-up atmosphere. I think helicopter pilots, along with their crew chief and gunners, certainly were involved in killing the enemy. That was the mission. But we did not have it in a close-up atmosphere where it may have impacted us psychologically as much as it did the grunt.
it's kind of a follow-up question, but do you think it is important that we remember about war and what's happened in war and why?
Every war should teach us a lesson. First of all, that you don't go into it without a great deal of thought, and when you do go into it, that you put all of the resources that are necessary to win that war. It's important to the troops that you send, that they understand that it's supported wholeheartedly. It's important to the families who remain back here that it's supported wholeheartedly. So sure.
I'm going to throw this out at you for something to think about, but I'm trying desperately, even as we're talking, to go to this reunion in Washington. I would like to just represent this project and try to get some interest. By the way, I'm going to interview General Hal Moore.
Yeah.
In,
Kentucky boy, by the way.
Yeah, he's living in Alabama. He has a home in Crested Butte, Colorado. I'm going to interview him this summer. He's gracious enough to give me an interview, and I probably won't interview him along the lines of the movie. I want to know about the air cab and all that. But would you be interested in going to Washington, D.C.? I mean, if I were to go, I guess what I'm thinking of, I've gone back to Normandy with Lewis. We documented his 60-year return to Normandy, but just something to think about. Don't commit to anything, but I would really like to go, and I'd like to go with a veteran. I'd like to have a camera, not on all the time, but at parts, and go to the wall, and there's going to be a big group going. But just
if you're interested at the time that you want to do that, give me a call, and if our schedules can marry up, I'm generally accommodative. One of the best jobs that I've ever had. I was State Director of Veterans Affairs here in Kentucky, and during that time we paid the Vietnam veterans a bonus here in the state of Kentucky, and I've built some nursing homes for our veterans. So I have a great appreciation for what all of our veterans have accomplished, and candidly, I do a lot now to support anything that we need to do to enhance their lives, and we're going to do that.